Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This video is intended solely for simulation and analysis, and does not represent any real event or practical instruction. What happens when an airfield strike that looks simple on paper turns into a fight for survival in a matter of seconds? At 14:07 local time, two FA-18 Super Hornets, call signs Raven 1 and Raven 2, were racing toward Iran's Kerman airfield. Their target was not a massive base that needed to be flattened by wave after wave of attacks. The target was only 3 Iranian aircraft sitting on the ramp. But these were not just any 3 aircraft. They were high-value airframes, difficult to replace, and if they managed to take off or escape the airfield, the strategic consequences would be far greater than their silhouettes suggested. Above them, an American drone was orbiting and feeding live imagery back to the strike package. And what it saw was not reassuring. The Iranians were no longer passive. Ground crews were racing against the clock. Fuel trucks were already in place. Technical crews were deep into startup procedures on at least one heavy aircraft. If Raven arrived even a few minutes late, the entire picture could change. The two Super Hornets widened their formation to the east to avoid terrain and preserve the cleanest possible attack axis. But the desert was not on their side. Just as both jets accelerated into the attack corridor, Raven 1's radar warning receiver emitted the sound every fighter pilot knows and never wants to hear. Fire control lock. An Iranian Tor M1 battery had just come alive from complete silence. It had not been transmitting beforehand. It had not searched. It had not warned. It had simply waited until the two Super Hornets crossed the horizon and then skipped the entire search phase to go straight to fire control. In other words, it was a textbook ambush. Raven 1's hands moved before he had time to think in words. One hand yanked hard on the stick. The other punched the countermeasure switch. The jet snapped into a 6G brake, enough to pull the horizon vertical and crush the pilot into the seat. Behind him, the electronic jammer and the countermeasure dispensers came alive at the same time. Raven 2 broke the opposite way, splitting the formation into 2 separate targets and forcing the Iranian battery to choose one. They chose Raven 1. The missile came in at terrifying speed. It was moving fast enough that even a tiny error would mean the difference between life and death. But the 6G brake, the jamming data, and the split formation distorted the firing solution during the most important seconds. The missile detonated behind Raven 1, not close enough to kill him, but close enough to remind both pilots that the original plan had just officially collapsed. That brake was not just a survival move. It shoved both aircraft off the planned corridor and into a different band of terrain, where another link in Iran's defensive chain was already waiting. Inside a mountain pass, a mobile surveillance radar unit picked up both jets as they turned back toward the northeast. That radar did not need to shoot. It only needed to see. And that was enough. The operator picked up a field telephone and called Kerman directly. 2 incoming aircraft. Medium altitude. High speed. Clear approach vector. That warning reached the airfield before Raven had fully regrouped. Only a matter of seconds. But in air warfare, a few seconds can feel like an entire lifetime. Worse still, Raven 2 began to notice another consequence of that 6G defensive pull. His targeting pod was no longer stable. The infrared image jittered, drifted, and slid off its reference point. At first glance, it looked like a minor alignment issue. In reality, the hard brake had damaged part of the optics inside the system. From that point on, the pod was no longer truly seeing with confidence. It was guessing. And in a strike against fixed targets inside a heavily jammed battle space, the difference between seeing and guessing is almost the difference between hitting and missing. At Kerman, the phone warning began paying off almost immediately. Zu-23 gun trucks started moving out of concealment. A Misagh, 2 shoulder-fired missile team climbed onto the roof of the maintenance hangar. Ground crews continued starting the Il-76 as if they knew exactly how little time remained before the bombs would fall. And then the Americans lost another crucial advantage. The Reaper that had been watching the airfield had to leave station because it was reaching its fuel limit. Its replacement still needed time to arrive. During that brief ISR gap, the Americans were effectively blind over the airfield. To the people inside the operations center, it was just a procedural delay. To the Raven pilots in the air, it was the worst kind of silence. Because without confirmed imagery, the rules did not allow weapons release. They had to wait. But while they waited, the Iranians kept moving. And the worst part was this: the Il-76 was not simply starting up to evacuate. When the replacement Reaper finally arrived and restored the picture, the Americans saw something that made the target even more important. Long olive green cases were being loaded into the aircraft through the rear ramp. They did not look like ordinary cargo. They did not look like spare parts. They did not look like emergency baggage. They suggested something much more dangerous. Iran was trying to move something more valuable than the aircraft itself. At that point, this was no longer just a runway attack on a few aircraft parked in the open. It had become a race to stop something important from leaving Kerman before it was too late. By the time the replacement Reaper arrived and the image stabilized, the ground picture had matured in the worst possible way. All three targets were still present. The Il-76 really was in the middle of startup. Two Zu-23 gun trucks were positioned at opposite ends of the runway. A Misagh-2 team was already set on the roof, and the entire airfield was covered by enough GPS jamming to turn precision-guided bombs into calculated gambles if they were released from too high. It was a true kill box. If Raven stayed high, their JDAMs could drift far enough off target to matter. If Raven dropped lower to improve accuracy, they would be forced straight into the engagement zone of the guns and the MANPADS. There was no clean option. Raven 1 chose to attack first, rolling in on the P-3F parked on the ramp. He started the dive from 12,000 feet, using his still functional pod to lock the target. Everything looked workable until the Zu-23 at the southern end of the runway opened fire. No radar. No lock. Just twin barrels pouring dense streams of fire into the airspace the Super Hornet was about to cross. That volume of fire did not require precision. It only needed proximity. Raven 1 had to break out hard. The release window vanished. The bomb stayed on the rack. A costly attack run had just been erased by a much cheaper weapon system. Raven 2 could not wait any longer. The Il-76 had been running engines for too long already. Every passing minute brought it closer to the point where it might actually move. He had to go in, even with a damaged pod. He dropped lower than Raven 1, taking on more risk in exchange for a real chance of hitting the target. In the brief instant when the picture stabilized just enough to approximate the center line of the Il, he pickled the bomb. The GBU-38 dropped free. From that moment on, it had to fight on its own. Not only against gravity and velocity, but against the Iranian GPS jamming network trying to push it off its intended path. The small fins in the tail kept correcting. Each tiny drift was adjusted, then distorted again by interference. It was an invisible fight all the way down. At the same moment, the Misagh-2 was launched. The missile team on the roof had waited long enough to get the rear aspect heat from Raven 2's engines. His missile warning system screamed. Raven 2 broke hard, dumped flares, and rolled the hottest part of the aircraft away from the seeker in one last effort to survive. The missile chased the decoys and detonated behind him. The bomb kept falling. It struck the Il-76. The fuselage tore open. Fire erupted exactly where the Iranian crew had spent more than 20 minutes trying desperately to get the aircraft moving. That transport would never leave Kerman. But the mission was still not over. Raven 2 had barely escaped the Misagh-2 when he flew straight through the engagement zone of the same Zu-23 battery that had already forced Raven 1 off his first run. Tracer fire ripped through the air just behind the jet. At that range, the gunner did not need to aim at the aircraft itself. He only needed to aim at the airspace. The FA-18 had no choice but to pass through. Raven 2 slipped through that stream of fire with corrections so small they were almost invisible from the outside. Fuel kept burning. The safety margin for the entire formation was falling toward warning state. But the targets were still there. Raven 1 came back in, this time from a completely different attack axis. His first failed run, had shown him exactly where the southern gun position was. Raven 2's pass had exposed the location of the Misagh-2 team on the rooftop. He used terrain and the hangar structure itself to mask the launcher's line of sight for the 3 most important seconds of the dive. That was not a long time. But for a pilot living on tiny attack windows like this, 3 seconds was an opportunity. Raven 1 locked the P-3F again. He released. The GBU-38 drove straight into the old patrol aircraft that Iran had kept alive for decades through improvised maintenance and constant patchwork repairs. It did not survive any longer. The second target disappeared in fire. Now only the C-130 remained. Another transport. Another old airframe. But still far too valuable to leave behind. The problem was that Raven 1 now had only 1 bomb left, and the fuel state on his display had already crossed into the zone where there was no room left for error. He knew exactly what that meant. Every second spent over this airfield was another second that made tanker rendezvous and carrier recovery less certain. And still, he went back in. The anti-aircraft guns opened up again. This time, the tracers were even closer. The gunner on the ground had now observed 2 complete attack patterns and had used both to refine his lead. Still, Raven 1 held the attack path. He locked the target. He dropped the final bomb. The GBU-38 separated, pushed through the jamming field, and struck the C-130 mid-fuselage. The third target was now out of the fight. At that point, all 3 Iranian aircraft the defenders had tried so desperately to save at Kerman had been destroyed. That was the final outcome of the mission. Not a fast, clean strike followed by a turn for home, but a chain of survival through ambush, temporary ISR blindness, damaged targeting optics, GPS jamming, anti-aircraft fire, shoulder-fired missiles, and collapsing fuel margins. And even after all of that, Raven 1 and Raven 2 still completed the mission. That is what makes this battle so dangerous. Not because the targets were massive, but because every small obstacle compounded into a lethal maze, where 1 delayed second, 1 bad angle, or 1 moment of hesitation could have collapsed the entire operation. At Kerman that afternoon, Iran did not sit still and wait to be hit. It ambushed. It delayed. It layered defenses. It blinded sensors. It distorted accuracy. And it forced the attackers to fight for every single release. But in the end, it still was not enough to save the aircraft on the ramp. 3 targets, 3 kills, and a victory earned in the narrowest possible way. If you found this video compelling, stay with us for the next one.